Hello students. Today we're going to talk about chapter 4 and the tissues that compose our body. So chapter 4 covers the 4 basic types of tissues and we're going to review them today. So first, a tissue at the tissue level of organization is considered to be groups of cells that come from a common embryonic origin, and they have specialized functions to bring about physiological responses in the body. There's only 4 basic types of tissue that make up everything in the body. We have epithelial tissues, several different examples of them, connective tissues, muscular and nervous tissue. These are the only 4 basic types of tissue that forms everything in the body, and there's multiple examples of epithelial, connective, and 3 types of muscle tissue. We'll cover the majority of muscle tissue in chapter 10 and nervous tissue in chapter 12. So cells and tissues actually make points of contact with each other. Some tissues have more, some have very few. In this case, these points of contact on this simple picture that we're looking at are points of contact that exist between epithelial cells. And the points of contact between the epithelial cells are called cell junctions. I put some animation links in our PowerPoint. You should go and review these. Obviously, you have to be connected to the internet to access the animation links. So let's go over the 5 types of cellular junctions. The first type is called a tight junction. And from this simple picture that we see here, this represents the membrane of one cell and the membrane of another cell. So the 2 adjacent cells are actually linked together very tightly by these little dots in the picture, which are called transmembrane proteins. And these are proteins that span the plasma membrane. So they go through the membrane of one cell and they link to the protein that's spanning the membrane of the other cell. In that way, it causes these 2 cells to be very tightly joined together. So these are called tight junctions because they basically are watertight. So water can't even get between the cells where we have the stitching pattern of the tight junctions. Adherens junctions include what we see here, where on the inside of the plasma membrane of a cell, there's something called a plaque protein that spans along the inside. That plaque protein, which is considered to be what is called an adhesion belt, lines up with the adhesion belt in the adjacent cell, and they are linked together by these transmembrane proteins, which are called cadherins. So the cadherins are one type of transmembrane protein that actually anchor and stick together in this extracellular space. In that fashion, these 2 cells are linked along the perimeter of the cell at this level. Desmosomes are another anchoring type of junction. These types of junctions are spread around the cell in various positions where we have a plaque protein, but now the plaque protein is resembling this circular disc that is placed in different areas on the inside of a cell, and the plaque protein is anchored to parts of the cytoskeleton. Here they show these little blue fibers. These are a type of protein fiber of the cytoskeleton, which are called intermediate filaments, and one type of intermediate filament that is pretty prevalent out of the 3 that are in the cytoskeleton is keratin. So these plaque proteins are stuck in the membrane along with the transmembrane protein, which is anchored to it. and they then bind and stick with other transmembrane proteins that go into the plaque of the desmosome in the adjacent cell. These are cadherin transmembrane proteins, as we've just seen, and it helps anchor the cells at this particular place together. So desmosomes and the adhesion belts are types of what we call anchoring junctions. The last type of anchoring junction is actually half of a desmosome. So these are called hemidesmosomes, and what we see is the plaque protein again, but notice we only have one half. There's not one on this side. So this plaque protein is still anchored to the intermediate filaments of the cytoskeleton. We now have a different type of transmembrane protein, albeit it still spans the membrane. It's just another type, and these are called integrins. So integrins and cadherins that we just looked at are called glycoproteins because these types of proteins also have sugar units on them. And the sugar units and proteins on animal cells always face the outside of the cell. So in integrins, it would be down here. If I go back, in the cadherins, it would be out here. So that's where the sugars are located. Now, the reason why this particular anchoring junction only has one half of a desmosome is because these are only found at the bottom membrane, or what we call the basal membrane of the epithelial cell, where the epithelial cell touches what is called the basement membrane. So all epithelial tissues actually sit on top of a basement membrane, and they're actually anchored to it with these integrins, and thus by the hemidesmosome. The last type of junction is not an anchoring junction at all, but rather it is what we consider to be a communicating junction. So these, which are called gap junctions, are basically specialized channels that line up at particular places in the plasma membrane directly adjacent to the similar type of channel in the plasma membrane of the adjacent cell. By lining up exactly, what we create is a water pore from one cell to another one. So molecules and ions can be passed back and forth from one cell to another one. These gap junctions, composed of proteins called connexins, are special channels that allow these cells to communicate. So water-soluble substances and water can move from one cell to another one. So these gap junctions with a specialized channel is called a connexin. Look at the spelling. The channel in one membrane is called a connexin, similar to the other one, but the proteins that make the channel up are called connexins, with INS on the end. So we're going to learn a little bit more about connexins when we cover some of the muscle tissue later on, and in AMP2 when we cover the heart. Connexins and gap junctions are loaded down in the membranes of cardiac muscle cells, but it's found in other tissues as well. Now, the main focus of this chapter, and what you're going to be learning, are the differences between epithelial tissues and connective tissues. What types of epithelial tissues do we have in the body? And what types of connective tissues do we have in the body? So if you look at this picture right here, some very prevalent differences that we can see. On the left-hand side, this represents an epithelial tissue, specifically a stratified epithelium, which we'll define in a minute. And on this side, we see a connective tissue. So right away, if you look at this picture for the epithelial tissue, you can see there are many, many, many cells. Each one of these is a distinct cell that are tightly packed together. Basically, their membranes are touching each other all over the place, which means most epithelial tissues contain many types of cellular junctions to anchor these cells together. The other thing that we can pretty much infer from the fact that all of these cells are tightly packed together is that there's very little substances on the outside of the cells in between each cell. And so the substances that are on the outside of cells is called the extracellular matrix, or the ECM. So there's very little extracellular matrix between these cells. That's totally different from connective tissues. In general, connective tissues have few cells that are scattered apart from one another, which means there's larger volumes of space separating the cell. And the larger volume of space is not just empty. It's filled with polysaccharides and proteins and other substances, something called a ground substance, and all of that represents the extracellular matrix. So rarely do connective tissue cells in connective tissues touch. Although sometimes they do, it's just very rare. It's not as consistent as we see in the epithelial tissue on the left-hand side of the picture. So the general features of epithelial tissues for lining and covering epithelial tissues is that the cells are arranged in sheets, and all of the cells are densely packed together, held together by many cell junctions. All epithelial tissues sit on top of a basement membrane, all of them, much like your house sits on a slab. So the concrete slab, your house is sitting on that, the concrete slab would represent, in this case, in my analogy, the basement membrane. Now, two very important characteristics of epithelial tissues are the last two bullets. Epithelial tissues, all of them, are avascular. That means they don't have any blood vessels that run between all of the cells of the epithelium. They do have a nerve supply that supplies them, though. And epithelial tissues divide. The cells divide quite rapidly via mitosis, which means they have a great capacity to regenerate. This is very evident if you consider the fact when you cut your skin, we're going to learn that part of our skin, the surface of it, is basically an epithelium. So when you cut down through there, the cells start to repair, divide through the repair process we'll learn in Chapter 5, and they fill in the gaps of all the cells that you cut away. And it happens fairly rapidly. So, epithelial tissue cells divide very quickly via mitosis. If you remember, this is a cloning event. So the cells basically clone each other and replace dead, dying, or old cells in the tissue. Now, this is a diagram that represents a very simplistic overview of epithelial tissues that are considered to be lining epithelium. That means they line surfaces in the body. In so doing, we can identify specific areas of the membrane. So consider this cell right here. This cell is taller than it is wide, in which case, in a minute, we're going to learn how to name this. This is called a columnar cell. However, if you notice, there is a free edge at the top, so there's nothing up here. So epithelial tissues, lining epithelial tissues, have a free edge somewhere. So the free edge, where no other cells or anything is touching it, is called the apical membrane or the apical surface. We then have the membranes on the side, which are called the lateral membranes or surfaces, and then the cells in the lining epithelium all touch a basement membrane. So the bottom membrane has to be anchored to this basement membrane. And remember, we just went over the junctions. Those would be considered the hemidesmosomes at this point down at the bottom. So the only place you have hemidesmosomes is always at the basal surface or the basal membrane, anchoring the cells to the basement membrane. Now, some of those other anchoring junctions, like the adhesion belts and the tight junctions and the desmosomes, are scattered throughout the rest of the membrane on the epithelial cells. Tight junctions typically are more towards the apical end, along with the adhesion belts, and desmosomes can be scattered all around the cell in 360 degrees. They're just not identified at the basal membrane. So in cell biology, often we call the side membrane or lateral membrane and the basal membrane by one word. We could say basolateral membrane. Now, the other thing we can notice from this picture is that there are no blood vessels running between these epithelial cells. So, where do all of these cells in the epithelium get what they need to live, since everything that cells need to live is located in the blood, flowing in the blood? Well, all epithelial tissues get what they need from the blood to live, like oxygen and sugar and other nutrients and ions, from blood vessels that run in an underlying connective tissue. So down here is a connective tissue, which would lie below the basement membrane. So all of the nutrients and oxygen and whatnot diffuse from the blood out into the extracellular space or extracellular matrix of the connective tissue, then diffuse up through the basement membrane to get to all the cells in the epithelium. Notice, though, that the epithelium is supplied by fibers from the nervous system. So we have some nerves that do supply our epithelial tissue. Now, the basement membrane that the epithelia are sitting on contain two areas. The very first area that you see, it's a little bit darker in this picture, is called the basal lamina. The structures and molecules in the basal lamina, which include sugars, polysaccharides, and some proteins, are secreted from the cells of the epithelium directly. So these cells of the epithelium are responsible for secreting the substances that make up the basal lamina. The reticular lamina, which is the deeper of the two layers, is composed of polysaccharides and proteins, which is secreted by the cells in the underlying connective tissue. And that deeper layer is called the reticular lamina. Collectively together, the basal and reticular lamina makes up what we call the basement membrane. Now, this is a generalized diagram of the structural aspect of epithelial tissues and their relationship to underlying connective tissues. So how do we name the epithelial tissues in the body, which we have many different examples of? Well, we name them basically for two reasons. Number one, epithelial tissues have different number of layers of cells. Some of the epithelial tissues only have one layer. So you see in this little simple picture, we have one layer of cells right here, and that's it. And these cells all touch the basement membrane. So when we have an epithelium in the body that is made up of only one layer or rows of cells, and all of the cells touch the basement membrane, it's called a simple epithelium. So simple will be in the name. However, if we have an epithelium that is made up of multiple layers or rows of cells, like in the picture over here, not all cells touch the basement membrane. So only the cells at the very bottom layer touch the basement membrane. All of these other cells are anchored together, though, fairly tightly with all of those junctions that we just covered. So they're anchored pretty tightly together. When you have an epithelium that is made up of multiple layers of cells, we have the word stratified in the name. So stratified epithelia are epithelia that are made up of more than one row of cells. Now, we do have an obscure example of an epithelium whereby if you looked at the epithelial tissue under the microscope, you would notice different layers or rows of their nuclei. They would have different layers of the nuclei. So upon first glance, you might suspect that this would be a stratified epithelium. Similar to over here, you have multiple layers where you can see the nuclei. However, this is deceiving because all of the cells in this tissue, all of them, even the ones that have a nuclei that are higher up in the cell, all of these cells touch the basement membrane. And by definition, if all of the cells are touching the basement membrane, then you can only have one layer of cells. So what is the difference here? Well, the difference with this tissue type, epithelial tissue type, which we would call pseudo-stratified, is this. All of the cells touch the basement membrane, but not all of the cells, like this one, reach the surface. So in this tissue type, pseudostratified epithelium, we have some cells that reach the apical surface of the tissue, but some do not. So that would give the appearance that we would have multiple layers of these nuclei. Now, so we can have simple pseudostratified or stratified in the naming system. The other way that we have to name the epithelium is based on their cell shape. So some epithelial cells are flat. See, they're not very tall at all. They're kind of squished out. These types of cells are tissue cells, and a tissue is called a squamous cell. And in the tissue name, it would have squamous in the name. Like we can have a simple squamous epithelium. So those epithelial tissues where we see the cells flattened out, we would have squamous in the name. In epithelial tissues where we see that the cells are about equal in height and width, which resembles a cube, we would call them cuboidal. And then, lastly, we have epithelial cells that are taller than they are wide. Those are column cells, so we would say a columnar epithelium. So in this naming system, we would have these types of names. We can have a simple squamous epithelium, simple cuboidal epithelium, simple columnar epithelium. Now notice there's three names, basic names in the name of one tissue. We have simple, the name of the shape of the cell, and then I say epithelium after it. I can also say we have a stratified squamous epithelium. There are stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar. They're more rare, typically found in certain types of glands in the body. But the stratified squamous epithelium, we are going to cover the two basic types in Chapter 5, which includes the skin. And we always say epithelium after it. So stratified squamous epithelium, stratified cuboidal epithelium, so forth and so on. We also have a pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. We say columnar after pseudo-stratified because the majority of the cells in this tissue are tall, like columns. Now, in your textbook, I need you to go to table 4.1. Table 4.1 lists out all of the epithelial tissue examples. Simple squamous epithelium, simple cuboidal, simple non-ciliated columnar epithelium, simple ciliated columnar epithelium, and the like. So I need you to go to this table and learn the locations and the functions of the epithelial tissues. There's going to be several questions on which tissue type is located where, which of the following tissues has a particular function on the test. So learn their locations, learn their functions, so you can answer which of the following tissues is located in lining the urinary bladder or whatnot. Which of the following tissues has a particular function? Now, we are not identifying the tissues on the lecture unit test. Okay, so that's for lab. So table 4.1. There's also a little animation on the overview of the epithelial tissues that you can review as you are studying. Now, besides having what we call a lining and or covering epithelial tissues in the body, we also have what's called glandular epithelium. All of the different types of glands that you can think of in the body are composed from groups of epithelial cells that are arranged together. These glandular epithelial cells have a specialized function for secreting a particular product. There are two basic types of glands in the body. So let's cover them briefly. In chapter 18, when we get to A&P2, we're going to cover all of the glands that are considered to be endocrine glands. All of the endocrine glands, which are made of epithelial cells. You see them all here in this picture. This happens to be a cross-section through the thyroid gland in your neck. You can see how these cells are more cuboidal in shape. So these form the thyroid gland and obviously would be involved in producing thyroid hormones. All endocrine glands produce a hormone and secrete it into the extracellular space, or what we call the interstitial fluid, covered in chapter 1. And those hormones then diffuse into the bloodstream and are transported around the body. Now, it's beyond the scope of this class to cover all of the endocrine glands and what those hormones control in the body. But all of the hormones that are secreted from endocrine glands in some form or fashion helps regulate all of our homeostatic, physiologically controlled conditions that we covered in chapter 1. Remember, the two different types of organ systems in the body that regulate all physiology include the nervous system and the endocrine system. It's just that the endocrine system controls physiology by releasing hormones. So these are what we consider to be signal molecules that really direct the activity of all the cells in the body. So in part, the cells in the body know if they're supposed to increase or decrease their metabolic activity according to which signal molecule they receive. And so some of those types of signal molecules are called hormones if they're released by an endocrine gland. They're actually called a neurotransmitter if it's released by the nervous system, which we'll cover in chapter 12. We'll actually begin it in chapter 10. The next type of gland that we have in the body is referred to as an exocrine gland. Now, like endocrine glands, the epithelial cells that make up the exocrine gland are specialized for secreting some product. So unlike endocrine glands, which all endocrine gland products have a common name called a hormone, exocrine gland secretory products do not have a common name. And we would have to name the product based on the particular gland that we are referring to. So for instance, some of the types of exocrine glands in the body include sweat glands, oil glands, glands that produce earwax in your ear. Those are called cereminous glands. We have certain glands in our digestive tract, like your salivary glands that line your oral cavity, produce saliva. The mammary glands. All of these are types of exocrine glands. And so we would have to name the product from each one of them specifically. For instance, we would say that from the sweat gland we produce sweat or perspiration. From the oil gland, which is called a sebaceous gland, we would have to name the sebaceous gland product oil, so forth and so on. This is something that you guys already know. So the little diagram that we see down here at the bottom is a section from the skin, and this is representative of, I should say, a sweat gland. So the sweat gland would produce perspiration, or what we call sweat, and then it would secrete it. However, no exocrine gland, including the sweat glands, all of them, all of their products have to be released into a duct, a tube, if you will. And the product is then delivered to the site of action via the duct. So all exocrine glands have a duct which will secrete the gland will secrete the product into the duct, and then the duct will carry the product to the site of action. In the case of a sweat gland, it secretes it to the surface of our skin. In the case of salivary glands, it secretes saliva to the inside of your mouth, your oral cavity, so forth and so on. No endocrine gland contains a duct. So that's a major anatomical or structural difference, if you will, between exocrine and endocrine glands. Exocrine glands have ducts, but endocrine glands do not. Now, glandular epithelial tissues forming the glands in the body can either be composed of just one cell or a single cell, in which case we would call it a unicellular gland. So the type that we're going to see through epithelial tissues are what we call goblet cells. Goblet cells in particular produce mucus. And these types of cells are found within what we call mucous membranes, which I'll define at the end of this packet. The majority of the glands that you're going to be thinking of when you start identifying them in lab and learning them here are actually composed of multiple cells, in which case we would call them multicellular. So these multicellular glands include the sweat glands called sudoriferous glands, the oil glands called sebaceous glands, and then the salivary glands, which we just covered. So those are all multicellular glands. Depending on how the gland secretes its product, the exocrine gland secretes its product, we can name the gland something different, generically, based on their secretory process. So, for instance, what we see over here, and I just want you to know really the definition of these. The majority of the gland cells in the body and the glands in the body secrete their product via the first example, merocrine secretion. So here they show the salivary glands. The salivary glands is a type of example of a merocrine gland. And so these types of glandular secretion is by simple exocytosis, if you remember that term from general biology. So here, the secretory product is produced, packaged in little vesicles. I'm not going to go back over all of these organelles of the endomembrane system. And the secretory product is then packaged into the final vesicle, which is called the secretory product. And the secretory vesicle, called the secretory vesicle, then fuses with the plasma membrane and then releases the product to the extracellular space, the interstitial fluid, if you will. So endocrine glands in the body secrete their product in this fashion. All endocrine glands secrete their product in this fashion for what we call water-soluble hormones. We'll cover that later. But nonetheless, salivary glands, sweat glands, and the like secrete their product via merocrine secretion. The second type of secretory process is called apocrine secretion. Apocrine secretion, like the mammary glands, produce products. They package their product in a vesicle, but instead of having the vesicle exocytose out the product, they just accumulate at the apical surface of the cell until the apical surface is filled with all of these secretory vesicles with their product. And then the cell pinches off the entire top of the cell. So as it pinches off the entire apical surface of the cell, this apical surface of the cell becomes the secretory product. That's why it's called the apocrine secretion, because the apical surface is the product. Now, these membranes all start to break down, which then release the product as it moves through the gland's duct. In this case, it would be milk proteins, and so the membranes would all have been broken down, so by the time the baby is eating, the milk proteins have been released. Now, the last type of secretory process is called holocrine secretion. Holocrine secretion is achieved by certain types of sebaceous or oil glands in the body. So here they show the skin. Here the cells ultimately divide over and over and over from the base of the gland, basically cloning themselves via mitosis, rapid cell division. And then as the cells are dividing, they get pushed upward through the layers of this multicelled gland. While the cells are moving up towards the apical surface where the duct would be located, they are involved in producing their product and storing them in these vesicles again. By the time the cell is totally filled with all of their secretory vesicles, the cell actually sloughs off, exfoliates, if you will, into the duct, and the whole cell becomes the gland's product. So that's called holocrine secretion. Now let's move into the connective tissues. The connective tissues in the body are composed of two basic elements that we can identify when we're looking at a tissue. Like epithelial tissues, there's going to be certain types of cells that are part of the tissue. But unlike epithelial tissues, the cells are spread apart, so that there's a lot of space between the cells, which is filled with substances called the extracellular matrix. This is also abbreviated the ECM in all capitals. Now, no connective tissue in the body has a free surface like epithelial tissues do, because all connective tissues are covered by other tissues, in particular epithelial tissues. Now, all connective tissues except for tendons, ligaments, and cartilage. Tendons, ligaments, and cartilage. All other connective tissues besides those are highly vascular. So we say they're highly vascularized. That means they have a lot of blood supply running through them, a lot of blood vessels running through them. They also have a large nerve supply that runs through them. In many cases, it's the connective tissue that is the supportive tissue that binds all of these blood vessels and nerves within an underlying tissue. So, tendons, ligaments, and cartilage are avascular. There's no blood vessels that run through the middle of these tissues. So those are the exceptions for the tissues that are vascularized, right? Here's a generic picture of a connective tissue we consider to be a loose connective tissue. And you can see there's multiple little fibers in here, right? There's different types of cells everywhere. There's nerves running through here. There's blood vessels running through here. And you notice there's a large volume of space. So besides having the cells everywhere, like white blood cells, like neutrophils, macrophages, basophils, all over the place, lymphocytes, plasma cells, mast cells, blood vessels, elastic fibers, reticular fibers, and collagen fibers everywhere, fibroblasts. That's all the different types of things that are in here. Look at the space between all the fibers in the cells. That is not empty space. The space is filled in with what is called a ground substance. There's different types of ground substances. The ground substance is involved in basically supporting the cells and fibers and binding everything together. It's also a medium through which we can have the exchange of nutrients, waste products, respiratory gases to and from the blood in the blood vessels to all the cells in the connective tissue, but also to all of the epithelial cells that would lie above a connective tissue, which is not shown in the picture. So this diagram actually represents what we call areolar connective tissue, one of the most abundant and widely distributed connective tissues in the body. Now, the extracellular matrix is basically everything that's on the outside of the cells. It's composed of all of the fibers and what we call ground substance. There's three basic types of fibers. There's elastic fibers, reticular fibers, collagen fibers. Not all connective tissues have all three fibers. Some of them do. Some of them have more reticular fibers than the other ones. Some have more elastic fibers. It depends on the connective tissue example that you're studying and learning about. Not all connective tissues contain every one of these types of cells. And some connective tissues have their own specialized cells. Like in bone. Bone is loaded down with osteocytes, which is the bone cell. Cartilage is loaded down with chondrocytes, which are the cartilaginous cells, so forth and so on. So there's sometimes specialized cells within the tissue. It just so happens that areolar connective tissue contains all of these different types of white blood cells, some fat cells in there, that's adipose cells, adipocytes, and then fibroblasts. These are the cells that produce all these protein fibers everywhere, right? Now, as far as the connective tissues are concerned, you're not going to be identifying all of these fibers. I just want you to know what the names of the fibers are that are part of the extracellular matrix. So we're not identifying any of this on the lecture test, but you still have to know their name. Now, the connective tissues are organized. The mature connective tissues in the body are organized into different categories. I listed here the main categories for, or subsections for, the mature connective tissues. For instance, some of the connective tissues are considered to be loose connective tissues because the cells are more spread apart and the fibers, more importantly, the protein fibers are spread apart. All right, so there's three basic types of loose connective tissues. We have areolar connective tissue, which I just identified. We have reticular connective tissue and adipose tissue. Those three tissue types can be found in table 4.4. The dense connective tissues include dense irregular, dense regular, and reticular. So those types of reticular connective tissue, those types of connective tissue are found in table 4.5. There are three basic cartilage types in 4.6. Bone is in table 4.7, and blood, which is a liquid connective tissue, is in table 4.8. I want you to go to these tables and learn the locations and the functions of the different types of loose and dense connective tissues, the locations and functions of the three different types of cartilages, and the locations and functions of bone and blood. So you need to go and study these tables. There'll be some questions on that. Which connective tissue is located here? Which connective tissue has this function? And the like. Now, there's also a little animation link that you need to review. I think the links are pretty good, so make sure you review them. And we're going to get into, at the end of the chapter, the membranes in the body. So, we have different types of membranes in the body that cover or line the different parts of the body. And the membranes can be classified in two specific ways. We have membranes that are considered to be epithelial membranes that are separated into either being what we call a mucous membrane, serous membrane, or cutaneous membrane. I'm going to show you these in a second. We also have a membrane that's found on the insides of certain types of joints in the body. We're going to cover the joints in Chapter 9. And those membranes are called synovial membranes. So let's look at these a little bit more closely. The epithelial membranes consist of three basic examples that are found in different places of the body. The first example that we see here, the mucous membranes. The mucous membranes are epithelial membranes, but they contain special single-celled glands or unicellular glands called goblet cells that secrete mucus to the surface of the epithelium. So these mucous membranes are located lining your digestive tract. Here they show the small intestine. This particular tissue type is considered to be a simple, non-ciliated, columnar epithelium. It is considered to be a mucous membrane. We have a mucous membrane that lines the respiratory tract. On the inside of your trachea, we have ciliated, pseudostratified, columnar epithelium, which also contains these goblet cells, which secrete mucus to the surface. So these types of membranes, like in the respiratory system, notice I said inside the respiratory system, and inside the digestive system, and lining the reproductive system, and the tubes of the reproductive system, and the tubes of the urinary system, we have mucous membranes. All right? But we also have epithelial membranes which are considered to be serous membranes. Serous membranes are composed of, always, a simple squamous epithelium. Here they show the outside of a lung. This is the respiratory system. So the outside of the lung is surrounded by a membrane called the pleural membrane. It's considered to be a serous membrane because the serous membranes in the body, these squamous cells, secrete a lubricating fluid to the outside of the organ. So your lungs in the thoracic cavity are lubricated by a serous fluid secreted by a serous membrane. That's the generic names. The pleural membranes, which there are really two, something called the parietal and the visceral pleura, secrete a serous fluid called pleural fluid, albeit it's just a little bit. But that fluid is what we call a serous fluid. Now, we also have a serous membrane that lines the outside of our abdominal organs, like your stomach and your large intestine and the small intestine. Notice I said the outside of it, not the inner lining, but the outside of these organs are all surrounded by a simple squamous epithelial sheet, which is all called the mesothelium, secreting a serous fluid. And in the abdominal cavity, that serous fluid is called pericardial fluid, and the serous membrane in the abdominal cavity is called the peritoneal. I said pericardial. Is the peritoneal membrane, and the serous fluid is called the peritoneal fluid. We have a serous membrane that surrounds our heart, and that's why I said pericardial. I was thinking ahead. The serous membrane that surrounds your heart is called the pericardial membrane. The serous fluid from that membrane is called pericardial fluid. So see, we have those three serous membrane areas. You have the pericardial membrane around the heart. You have the pleural membranes around your lungs. And you have the peritoneal membrane around your abdominal organs, like your stomach and your large intestines and the small intestines and the like. Right? Secreting their own serous fluid for lubrication. Now, we also have something called the cutaneous membrane. The cutaneous membrane basically is your skin. The very surface of the cutaneous membrane is an epithelium referred to as the epidermis. So the very top of our skin is composed of an epithelium, which is specifically a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Collectively together, the epidermis, along with the underlying connective tissue and the associated structures in the dermis, actually forms your skin, which is the cutaneous membrane. This is our first line of defense against everything, because this is our physical barrier between the outside world and the inside of your body. It covers the entire surface of our body. The last type of membrane is actually composed of specialized cells that resemble epithelial cells. They're called synoviocytes. These synoviocytes secrete a lubricating fluid as well, and it has some nourishment in it. And that fluid from the synoviocytes is called synovial fluid. The synovial membrane, as it's called, lines the inside of the joint capsule, or joint cavity, if I should say, on certain types of joints in the body, which are all would be called synovial joints. Synovial joints have a space between the adjoining bones called the joint or synovial cavity, which the synovial membrane lines it. And the synovial membrane is made up of those synoviocytes, and the synoviocytes secrete the synovial fluid inside the joint space, joint cavity. That helps lubricate the bones as they move past one another when you create movement. And the fluid also has nutrients and respiratory gases in it that help nourish the cartilaginous pads at the adjoining ends of the adjoining bone. All right, so that's it for this chapter. We will be covering chapter 5 after this. So once you're finished studying chapter 4, please continue into the information in chapter 5, as chapters 1, 4, and 5 will be on our first unit exam.